On today's episode of the Fandom Science Podcast, we go behind the scenes and into the athlete's mind when they're under pressure. How does choking really happen from a psychological perspective? And what personality traits can make an athlete more susceptible to it? Are right-handed athletes more likely to choke compared to lefties? We also talk about what strategies athletes should work on to avoid choking and what their coaches can do to help them with it. All of that and more with Dr. Chris Mesagno, a sports psychologist from Federation University, Australia, and one of the world's leading experts in this topic. As always, I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you do, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast for the best sports science content. So the first question I want to ask you is, and this is what I usually ask my guests, is how did you get started in your field and what made you choose your area of work? Because it seems like in sports science and sports psychology, everyone's got a different path.
Yeah, so I'll start off by a shortened version. Most of us in sports science sort of like sport in general, and I'm by trade, if you will, I'm a 10-pin bowler. So I like any sport that's related to the mental side. I'm involved in right away. I play some golf as well. So anything that gets you, any sport that gets you thinking is what I like to do. So so I got involved just by getting involved in the sports area and also learning about sport and the fact that golf and 10-pin bowling and those sports, when you get to an elite level, the mental side is quite important. So I started doing that, and then I got into psychology and then learned about sports psychology when I went to the University of Florida. And I went, well, that's my career path right there. Don't know exactly how it's going to go, but I wanted to learn about that and sort of went into, sports psychology and sort of, as they say in Australia, Bob's your uncle. That's it. Voila. That's how I got here.
Yeah. And I mean, what better setting to study choking than golf, probably? Because they're probably under the most scrutiny when it comes to choking.
Yeah. Well, golf is, one of the sports it's easy to know when someone's not doing very well in a performance setting. So so that's part of the reasons, part of the reason why I just wondered, look, why do people, experience this? What happens when this actually occurs? So that's one of the reasons why I got into it and started to get interested in it.
Right. Well, so let's get into it. So then, when we talk about choking, we hear it a lot in the mainstream media. Every time there's a big sporting event, someone loses, someone wins, there's a choker. It's a big storyline every time. What's the difference between how choking is defined in the mainstream media versus sports psychology? And also, what's your own definition of it?
Yeah, so it's interesting you say that there's a debate at the moment on what choking actually is, and in the research anyway. And right now, there is a large discrepancy, I would say, in the mainstream media and what it is in the research. Mm-hmm. In the fact that we look more at the amount of the decrease in performance, although it's hard to differentiate between what choking is in a mainstream sort of media and what it is in performance, let's say in an experimental setting. So in the media, it's pretty much anything goes. People talk about choking as if someone makes a mistake and they say, and you might experience anxiety in that situation. And the people say it's a choke in a media context, but in a research context, you need to be a little bit more specific on what it is. It is you have to have a few elements. You have to have heightened pressure or anxiety in that context. You need to have substandard performance, but standard that of a normal standard. So you have to have some normal contact
baseline or
baseline to look at it from. And that might not necessarily be novices. Novices, that there's a debate at the moment whether novices can actually experience choking or not, because we can't really, in a research setting, if you get people that are inexperienced at a task, how do you know it's choking when it might be just that they're not good enough yet at that particular performance? So how we define it in a research context, if you will, it's basically having an increase in anxiety and a large decrease in performance from what is normally expected. And that's kind of, a generic sort of a hybrid between a generic definition and a research-based definition, if you will.
Right. No, that definitely makes sense. And you're right about the point of novices. I mean, they would know if they're choking or not, because only they know where they're at usually as far as their standard performance. But from a research setting, it could be difficult to identify. Now, I'm wondering if you can sort of take us behind the scenes and into the athlete's mindset when they're under pressure and when they're choking. So what are the main mechanisms or models of choking that sports psychologists have identified, and how do they work?
Yeah, so there's two main theories or models that are related to choking. One is called the self-focus model. There's a number of different names for it, but self-focus model or conscious processing model basically is or hypothesis. And basically what that suggests is that when anxiety increases, people choke because they tend to think too much about their performance. So colloquial terms might be paralysis by analysis. So they perform badly because they're analyzing things too much, even though that performance, if they're experienced enough, that performance should be automatic. They shouldn't have to think about it as much. So they kind of, revert back to a stage of learning where they're consciously processing things.
Okay,
go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
I was going to say the second model is just the distraction model, in that the individual, when you increase anxiety, individuals get distracted. People get distracted by things, whether it be internal distractions, how you're feeling, or it could be external distractions of crowd noise or people around you, those types of things. So again, it could be either or, and some people suggest that there might be, these two mechanisms, these two models might interact, as one. I've suggested that you may not be able to pick apart those two models, and they might interact a little bit together, and it might be a result of the anxiety itself.
Right, and so if we can dissect each one a little bit, when we talk about self-focus, so an athlete, after hours and hours and years of practice, they have the movements and the skills kind of ingrained in them. They become automatic. But then in self-focus, they kind of deviate from that and they go back to their earlier stages of skill development. Is that kind of what happens?
Yeah, so exactly. So in the self-focus model, that's kind of where they're at. When they're experienced and they're experts, they shouldn't have to think too much about how to execute. But anxiety actually somewhat voluntarily or involuntarily makes them become more conscious about how they're performing, because maybe it's perfectionism or those types of things that they want to make it right, and they potentially do sort of revert back to those rules or instructions that their coach might have given them, when they were first starting out.
Right.
Yeah.
I think I'm nowhere near an elite level athlete, and I'll never will be, but
neither am I. No one is.
But no one listening is anyway. But I can just recall from my experience. Let's say when I play soccer and there's a penalty kick. If it's at the end of the game and maybe it's a close game and I know it'll make a big difference whether I score this or not, I start to kind of think about things I would not think about normally because they're automatic.
Yeah.
Like I like to, I'd start to think about where the positioning of my feet are, which way am I supposed to run? Like all those things that normally would be an automatic movement, I start to breaking them down step by step, and that kind of throws me off.
Yeah, and that's amazing, isn't it? Like even to the point that people think about how they're walking if they're just walking down the street and they get nervous about something. It's just a bit, yeah. It's strange, isn't it? It's something you shouldn't have to think about. You kind of start thinking about in that instance.
Yeah, or like if you have a job interview and you're nervous and you start like, where do I put my hands? Like, what do I do with my hands? Yeah. Normally, you're not thinking about where your hands are. Your hands are just your hands.
Yeah, should be natural, right? Exactly.
Yeah. So, okay, when it comes to self-focus, then what kind of strategies do sports psychologists work with athletes on to alleviate that side of choking?
So self-focus, there's a couple different research strategies that we use. We want to try to get the individual out of their own head if we're talking about self-focusing. So I've used, originally there was research done on doing two things at once. So it's called dual task paradigm. And basically, initially researchers started asking people to just, when they're performing a task, let's say a basketball free throw, shot, when they're performing a basketball free throw, they asked people to do some arithmetic tasks. So, for example, counting backwards by 7 from, counting backwards from 1,000 by sevens, just doing 1,997 and continue on from there. So backwards. So it's not normal, something different. And what that was to do is to distract the person from actually thinking about what they were supposed to be doing. So basketball free throw. All right, make sure that my hand is here and make sure I follow through and all that stuff. So, in that case, it's making people to think about the arithmetic or the math problem rather than the actual skill, which allowed the body to do what it's supposed to do at a time when you might be anxious or at a time when you might start thinking too much, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's like a cheeky way of tricking your brain into... Yeah, I mean...
Exactly, yeah, absolutely right. So that was one early on. So I used music as a way to do that as well. So I got people, initially the study was, you can do this with any music. What we used in this context was a song, Always Look on the Bright Side of Life by, and it was long time ago, Monty Python, Life of Brian. Awesome. It was a musical. And we used this Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. And it was a cheeky way of saying, look, nothing is that bad, especially in sport. You might be anxious, but it's not, you're not going to die from it and all that stuff. So it used music and cognitive restructuring and those types of things, just thinking about the situation differently to get people to get out of their own head. And it was with music. So we would ask people to make sure that they concentrate when they're shooting it in the basketball setting. When they're shooting a free throw, make sure they're concentrating on the words of the song. So again, they're thinking about the song rather than actually focusing on the task itself. And that kind of helped improve performance from that perspective as well.
And so, thinking about the song or thinking about arithmetics, something along those lines would get them, like you said, out of their head and revert back into their automatic phase where they're executing a skill that's, ingrained in them as opposed to thinking about all those steps.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right.
And so another strategy that I read often about is analogy motor learning. Could you explain a little bit how that works?
Yeah, so that's Rich Masters coined that. basically there's two sides of the coin in relation to learning. Explicit learning, where coaches do a great deal of this. They do this all the time. They tend to over instruct. So giving too many rules, too many explicit instructions on how to perform a task, and that leads to this self-focus, where initially, when you're in the cognitive stage of learning, when you're thinking about things and trying to do things, if your coach is giving you information, when you get into more autonomous or automatic stages of learning, then you become more inclined to think about those rules when you perform a skill, especially when you're an expert. So what Rich Masters did was he came up with a way to instruct in an analogy setting. So he used table tennis players as an example. So instead of giving people all of these rules of table tennis and how to hit a forehand, what he did was he just told people to draw a triangle. So draw a triangle from, up. I don't know how your listeners are just listening to this, so I'm trying to instruct at the same time.
I hope they could imagine a triangle.
Yeah, so triangle in a table tennis forehand motion. So sort of up and back, down, and then forward. Draw a triangle in that situation. So in that case, you don't have many rules of how to perform the skill. All you're doing is drawing a triangle. And what he found under pressure for experienced players was that, that triangle, drawing the triangle, actually led to better performance under pressure. Instead of explicitly sort of thinking about the rules of the actual task itself. So, I think that's a good way. If coaches, especially those listeners that are coaches, can actually think about ways to coach people in an analogy setting, then they're likely to improve performance under pressure rather than decrease or choke under pressure, because they don't think about those rules. They just think about the triangle, drawing the triangle when they're hitting the forehand.
And that's because in practice settings, their coaches overload them with information. And so when they get into the game, well, the coach is not in their ear telling them what to do. And so they're like, okay, well, what am I supposed to do now? I'm not used to someone not telling me what to do every step of the way. And then they start to choke.
Yeah. And that's part of the reason. I feel like I call it overanalyzing, generally. And some people are more prone to overanalysis, just in general, or overlearning or overthinking. You can call it overthinking. And, when some people are prone to overthinking, they tend to use what is there. And if that knowledge is there, then they will tend to use it. So I try to, when I'm suggesting to coaches what to do, when they're coaching, probably limit the amount of information. Obviously people need information, but especially if those people that are, in their personality, they tend to overthink, or maybe they're perfectionistic. Try to limit the amount of information you give to that athlete, because they will, when they're anxious, they'll go back to that and use that. And that's not necessarily good.
Yeah. And you know what that reminds me of is, so I come from the family of teachers. My dad is a teacher. My mom's a teacher. I tutor myself and I TA at school. And one thing I try to do always is when I'm teaching someone or tutoring them is not to hold their hand every step of the way, especially when it comes to math or something, because when it comes to the test and I'm not there to hold their hand through every question, they're going to choke under pressure. And a lot of my students experience that when I first start working with them. They tell me when it gets to the test, I panic and I screw up. And so I work with them on practicing on their own, analyzing things on their own, and not me force feeding them information all the time.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And that's, in sports setting, I call it also coaching dependent. You don't want to, in that case, you're the coach and, you're feeding them the information. Yes. But they could become dependent on that information. A lot of times they can become dependent on that information. And if you continuously give them that information, and then when they, shoot a jump shot or do a free throw in basketball, and they don't have that information to say, well, what happened, then that's not necessarily good for them. And in your case, it's the same from a test taking perspective. If they don't know, if they're not getting that information from you all the time, they could tend to, when they're anxious, not be able to do it. So it's good to limit the amount of information sometimes, especially in a sports setting.
Right. And so are there any other strategies that sports psychologists usually work on when it comes to self-focus?
The other one that's recently I'm doing some research with some of my colleagues in Germany on brain hemisphere priming. Or we call it left hand contraction. So to make a long story short, if you squeeze a softball in your left hand, that actually activates the right side of your brain. If you squeeze a softball in your right hand, that activates the left side of the brain, just in general.
Right.
And again, the left side of the brain is the more analytic side, and that's probably where the self-focus model sort of comes from. If you're talking about brain functioning, the right side is more of your emotional context, less analytic side, relaxation response side of things, just in general. And so what we're doing is we're squeezing a softball in the left hand to actually activate the right side of the brain, so that side can be more activated more rather than the left analytical side of your brain. So if we can activate the right side a little bit more prior to performance under pressure, then maybe we can actually decrease choking. And what we've found, we've gotten mixed results so far. Jürgen Beckman and his colleagues in 2013 sort of found this positive result, but recently we've found positive but also sort of mixed results with different sports from this perspective. So it's going to happen. We're going to get mixed results sometimes. But again, those people that are more analytical, this might be actually beneficial for them, getting them more relaxed. And I've used it in my sport, 10-pin bowling as well. And I feel like I'm less analytical when I'm actually squeezing the softball in my hand too, just as a general sense. And it might not, be effective for everyone, but for me, I feel like, it's, if nothing else, it's actually relaxing me, as a stress ball, usually does relax people if they're squeezing it a bit.
Right. And so this is probably one of the most interesting things I heard in sports psychology and sports science in general. And I wanted to ask you about it. And it's related to what we were just talking about. So are right-handed athletes more likely to choke under pressure because of this right hemisphere, left hemisphere relationship? And how does that process work neurologically?
Yeah, well, that's a very difficult question to answer from a scientific point of view, because technically, and I have an article out recently on this. Technically, there's less left-handed people in the world, so it's very difficult to really get an understanding of this. But what we've found generally, and the trend in our study, is that yes, right-handed people tend to choke a little bit more than left-handed. But again, it's very difficult to look at scientifically because there's less left-handed people. So in that context, it's always been a right-handed dominant world, hasn't it? Coaches, when you're coaching, you coach in a right-handed context. If I'm coaching someone, I talk in a right-handed context, and left-handers, they have to think a little bit differently than us. So in that way, they may actually experience the world in a different way. They have to, be more creative, and the right side of your brain is the more creative side of your brain anyway. So the left-handers actually they have to consider things from our perspective and theirs. They have to translate things. They have to be more creative in how they do things. So they use generally they potentially use more of their right side of their brain. So that's why if they can be creative, if they're more creative, they tend to experience less choking just in general, because they don't think as analytically, let's say the right-handers do from a general standpoint.
Right. And so because there's a cross between what brain hemisphere controls what side of the body, like the left hemisphere is for right-sided movements, and the other way around. So if you're a righty, then the left hemisphere is activated, and the left hemisphere is where all that analytical, judgy type of side of the brain is, and that's what causes more choking compared to the lefty, whose right hemisphere is activated, and that's relaxing and all that stuff.
Yeah, if you say it in the ball squeezing context, there's probably more to it than that, but you're on the right track. Right-handed people generally, if you're thinking about what side of the brain, contralateral side of the brain, actually, you use when you're playing sport and you're dominant. Yes, that is correct. Although, generally we can't say that just because you're using your right hand more, you're always going to be in your left side of the brain type thing. But yeah, that's generally the idea.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a bit of an oversimplification, but yeah.
Correct.
And it seems like lefties are just blessed in a lot of ways, like in combat sports, for example, their southpaws are more likely to win because it's called like the fighting hand effect, I think. And basically, like, there are more righties, and so when you're a lefty, the opponent can't read your movements, but you can read their movements because you've seen a million righties in your career. They haven't seen that many lefties, and so they have the advantage over you. They just have it made, those lefties.
Yeah, and that's not only in fighting sports, baseball, those sports, tennis. Many of the players say that, especially the right-handed players, many of the players say that their perception or the reading of the cues in that perspective is a little bit different when you're right-handed going against a left-handed player or pitcher or whatever you want to call it. It's just a little bit different. So absolutely, you're right.
Yeah. And so, okay, going back to the models or the mechanisms of choking. So we talked about self-focus and the strategies used with it. So the other mechanism is called, or we refer to it as, it's distraction. So how does that work, and what kind of strategies are used for it?
So distraction, as mentioned before, is about distraction. So internal or external distractions to you. And basically there are a couple that are more pronounced, at least in the research, than it is anywhere else. Interventions that actually work. Routines, so pre-performance or pre-shot routines actually are beneficial from a distraction theory perspective, because it gets people. So distraction is about maintaining focus and concentration on the task at hand. So the model, it suggests that you get sidetracked by distractions. So in this case, what you want to do is, if you know that you're choking because you're distracted, you want to maintain your focus on the task. So there's a couple strategies. Pre-shot routine is one of them. So that's basically thinking and behaving in the same way prior to execution of the shot. So if you want to, if we're talking about tennis, for example, taking a couple deep breaths before you actually, hit a serve, or in golf, doing your normal routine before you actually hit the ball. So that's the basis for that. And our studies have found that routines are actually effective in improving performance when you're under pressure. So again, it maintains your focus on the task. And even, in interviews we've had with participants, they've actually said, look, I've been more focused. I've concentrated better when I've had a routine and was able to focus on that routine before I actually attempted the shot. Another one is a quiet eye. So that's a good one as well. Quiet eye period is basically the short amount of time you take before when you're targeting, the short amount of time you take to focus on the target. And if you maintain that quiet eye period, or if you maintain that focus for longer before the execution of the skill, you tend to be more accurate. So that quiet eye period is good for accuracy-based sports. Golf is one, 10-pin bowling is one where you're actually focusing on a target and you have to hit that target. Archery is another. So if you can maintain focus on the target for longer, then you're more accurate. So in this context, in this case, the training of that quiet eye period is what we're talking about. So studies have shown, Sam Vine and Mark Wilson have looked at this, training the quiet eye period and making sure that people look for a longer period of time at a target before they actually execute. And they found good results in relation to performing under pressure from that point of view.
So like an example of that could be a baseball batter, when you step up to the plate and you're facing a pitcher, and the quiet eye is like the last fixation that you have on the ball as it's approaching you before you hit it. And so if you can prolong that fixation on the ball, you're less likely to choke, basically.
Yeah, you can say that from a baseball perspective, but the ball is actually moving in the pitcher's hand, and then also as it comes toward you. So it's very difficult to, you can look at quiet eye from that perspective, but it's probably easier in a context of something that's not moving. So an archery target, as an example, you're fixated on that target. You take the arrow back with the bow, and before you actually release, your eye gaze is fixated on the target for longer, and then you release instead of being all over the place. Novices might have their eyes on the target for less time, and they might shift or have less fixations on the target than an expert would in that context. So you've got the right idea, but in baseball, the target is moving too much, so it's more difficult to explain in that context, but it still applies.
Yeah, I guess, maybe it would be a lot more efficient in a sport like archery, or, where the target is not moving. For example, in soccer, like when they had this study on penalty kicks where they measured the team's baseline performance in penalty kicks, and then they trained them on quiet eye. Basically, as you're approaching the kick, you prolong your fixation on where you're going to kick the soccer ball, like what area of the net. And then the more you prolong that fixation, their scoring got better. That's kind of...
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. Yeah. Yep.
So we talked about the mechanisms, the causes of choking, the strategies, and all that. I want to ask you, what are some personality traits that predict choking? And is there a way to screen for those traits earlier on? Let's say when I'm, selecting athletes for my team, is there a way to screen for those things?
Yeah, that's a great question. If we could solve that question or hone in on that question, in one study specifically, and say, look, we will, someone who has, let's say, perfectionistic tendencies, as an example, will they choke or other things? Yeah, and that's the $100,000 question, especially from a talent ID perspective. So yeah, there are personality characteristics. Perfectionism might be one of those, although it's less studied. But certainly people that are more perfectionistic tend to want to do better and perform better. So yeah, perfectionism might be one of those. Some of the studies that I've looked at, there are three that are more common. One is trait anxiety, which is basically how anxious you generally might feel. Some people are more anxious generally than others, and their characteristics is to be more anxious. So trait anxiety, the higher your trait anxiety, the more likely you are to choke. Another one is self-consciousness. So basically, someone who is more conscious of what people think about them or how they look may have an effect on whether you choke. Again, similar to trait anxiety, as you increase your feelings of being self-conscious, the more likely you are to experience choking. And then another one that is debated at the moment is the way you cope. So whether you approach a situation and approach the anxiety that you might experience, or whether you avoid that, leads to more choking behavior. So if you approach the anxiety and want to know why you experience that anxiety, if you're an approach coper on that, you tend to experience choking more so than if you avoid the reasons why you are anxious, if you will. So, if you're avoidance coper and you don't think about the anxiety and try to get away from it, then you tend to choke less from that point of view. So those are the three, that I've used in some of my studies, and in that context, we found that we can predict, at least somewhat, predict choking from those three measures. Although, if you look at my PhD dissertation, only 50% of all of my participants actually experienced choking when using those three measures. So, in the context of whether you can predict choking and whether you can identify people, and taking it into the context of those were experimental based studies where you can't create the anxiety that people have in a regular sport context. 50% ish of people actually experience choking in that context. So I think there are more predictors of choking than that, such as perfectionism, such as what Masters calls reinvestment, and that is the likelihood of thinking too much in the self-focus model, thinking too much about the explicit rules of the context. So reinvestment might be, or predispositional reinvestment, as Rich Masters talks about. So those are just five that might be involved. Narcissism and all of those are as you increase those, you then increase the likelihood of choking. Narcissism is another one where it's the opposite. So the more narcissistic you are, the less likely that you are to experience choking. So if you love yourself, too much, you're less likely to perform, and that's part of that is related to confidence. The more confident you are, the less likelihood you are to experience choking. So there's a number of them, number of personality characteristics that might be related, that need to be studied potentially together, to be have a good idea of whether we will actually choke based on those.
Right. And yeah, you just mentioned just answering that that's the $100,000 question. It's more like $10 million question, because let's say I was just watching the MLB Draft and looking at all those players being selected into baseball, and I mean they're all being handed $1 million contracts right away, and the separators between the 15th pick and the 16th pick is so minuscule that if you can identify one thing that will give you a better athlete than the other, that's millions of dollars worth of knowledge. So
yeah, and unfortunately, though, a lot of athletes are smart. So even if you can identify through questionnaires how high or low these athletes are, they either may, if they think that it's going to affect whether they get selected, they may change the way they respond. That's not necessarily true to themselves and their personality, or it might be that they change the way they respond in a performance context. Based on the personality, it may not necessarily be that their personality, when they answer the questions, it's actually how they would respond in the competition. So that's another reason why it's difficult to predict sort of and identify who's going to experience choking from that context, because people change the way they actually respond in the situation, um, you know, from that context. So yeah, it's difficult from
Yeah.
that respect.
Yeah, it is difficult, especially in draft settings where every player has an agent and they drilled those answers into them to answer each question perfectly, and like they're never going to show you their hand where they're weak, and so
Absolutely.
yeah. And so I want to ask you this: so after choking, let's say an athlete has a game where they choke, they have a big underperformance. What can they do to kind of recover mentally from that and move past it, so that in the next game and in the next season they're able to kind of pick back up?
So you're saying after it's happened, can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
And then the next time they come into competition, what can they do?
Yeah, because I'm sure that's going to leave like a little bit of a traumatic experience in their heads. Like, well, last time I was in this moment, I choked big time. I let my team down, my coach down, embarrassed myself on TV or whatever. How can they move past that?
Yeah. So in my practical view, rather than my research view, my applied view, I think choking is largely concentration dependent. And what I mean by that is, if you know what happened last time, and you know that your attention changed based on the anxiety that there is experienced, that was experienced, then concentration dependent for me means make sure that you concentrate on the relevant things that you need to when you're performing that skill. So, in golf, for example, in large part, it's all about what you're thinking about at that particular time and what you concentrate on. What is effective for your concentration at that moment? So the way to get out of that mindset is to make sure you're focusing on what you need to do when you need to do it. So in a golf situation, that routine, if a pre-performance routine or a pre-shot routine keeps you focused on what you have to do right then that's going to be beneficial to you. And what I do sometimes with athletes is I set goals, and it's not general goals. It's not goals about I want to win this and all that stuff. It's about routine goals. So in sports that I work with, such as 10-pin bowling and golf, one key aspect to keep them focused on concentration is set a goal of how much of a routine you can do, or what percentage of a pre-shot routine you should do prior to each shot, firstly, and then also over the competition. So I might say, look, I want you to concentrate on your routine, and if that focuses you the most and you want to hit a target the most, I want you to set me a goal that you think you can achieve that keeps you focused on that routine. Because it's not focused about, a lot of people that I work with, they focus on winning. They focus on a score, but it's the routine that keeps you, your concentration and your focus. So I say, look, let's set a percentage of 90% of all of my shots. I want to go through my routine, and I want to make sure that I do it every single time and the similar way every time, because then I know I'm focusing. And I know where my concentration is. And that is including when you become anxious, or if you become anxious throughout the competition. So more than likely, your athlete that you're talking about, when they choked, they got anxious and they changed their concentration to something else. So if I can get that athlete to 90 or 95% of the time do their routine, or do something that focuses their concentration on what they have to do to do well, then that actually maintains concentration. And if they can tick that box every single time that they go to throw a shot or whatever it is, then long term, they can say that they've actually ticked the box off 95% of the time. Most likely that outcome winning will actually take care of itself if you focus on the routine itself and concentrate as you normally would.
Yeah, that's very true. Even it's just a human nature to keep focusing on outcomes all the time. We're kind of like outcome focused beings, but really it's all about the process. If you focus your goals on the process, the outcome, and you keep doing that long term, more often than not, the outcome will take care of itself.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And I've talked to athletes about that a number of times, and that's what the best athletes do. They don't get distracted by the outcome. And even if they do, they bring it back to what they need to do right then and focus on that process before they actually get to the result or the outcome.
Right. So I want to ask you about team collapses. So there's a lot of famous examples of choking on a team level. We can think about the Falcons against the Patriots in the Super Bowl, or the Warriors blowing a 3-1 lead, and lots more. Here in Toronto, I'm sure if I have any listeners in Toronto, they would recognize the Leafs versus the Bruins. So does this team collapse have the same mechanisms as individualized choking, but it's on like a mass team level, or is it different?
Yeah, it's a good question that I can't answer totally at the moment, because there's just not enough research out there to suggest exactly what happens. But in my infinite, or I should say infancy view, not infinite, my infancy view, the fact that there's not much out there, what I would suggest is that there's so team choking, just in general, the team collapse is basically similar to the individual choking, but in that the team sort of decreases their performance collectively. So in this context, what I would suggest is what happens generally is that teams communication dies in some respects. So decrease in communication, it might be that they start to play instead of aggressively, assertively, if you will, they tend to play tentatively, and because they're trying to not lose instead of actually winning. So there's a difference between those two contexts. If you're playing to win, you're playing aggressively as you normally would, but instead the team tends to play less aggressively or tentatively, and they play to not to lose. So in that context, that's part of it. That's part of the causes. And it might be that, one player, what we've found in some of my PhD students' research is that, one significant player, important player, if he or she is having a bad day, that may affect all of the other players, like a contagion within the team. Or if they make a bad shot, or if they have a bad outcome or result of something, that creates a contagion, an emotional contagion that might actually affect the result of everyone else, and then everyone else starts playing bad or emotionally gets angry or frustrated or whatever, and it may go through the entire team. So again, in my view, team choking is more about the emotion and also the contagion that happens related to the collapse. And I think in large part it's largely because teams actually play not to lose, rather than play to win.
I think that's a great point. And it's like a common trend that you see in every team that blows a lead in a series or a game, is that they're up and they're winning, and then they get complacent and they take their foot off the pedal and they start trying not to lose, or like maintain the lead. Basically, when you're trying to maintain the lead, you're trying not to lose. You're not trying to, keep winning. And that's a huge part of it.
Yeah. And I think that's in large part, there's a time when you can milk the clock, if you will.
Yeah.
But if you take your foot off the gas too much, then if something goes wrong, you're, quote unquote, for lack of a better word, screwed.
Yeah.
Pardon my French for those people that don't necessarily like those words, but yeah, it just collapses around you. And, it could be the coach that starts that, it could be a key player. But yeah, it just collapses around you.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've already taken up a lot of your time, but I only have a couple questions left for you, and I want to get them in. What, like, could the opponent's behavior, let's say trash talk and stuff like that, lead to choking too? Does that have an effect on the anxiety level of players?
So if you go by my response before in relation to concentration, I think you'll know the answer to that question. And that is
Yes.
absolutely. If someone gets in your head, you can certainly the whole point of trash talking, and we call it sledging over here in Australia. If the whole point of sledging is to get the person to be distracted. You can't really say that if someone chokes because someone is sledging or trash talking is because of the models that I talked about before. But you can certainly say that, I guess if you want to put it to one model, it might be distraction related, in that, if someone's sledging or trash talking you, at you, then you're trying to distract that person and in turn get them out of their own head and change the way they think. So yeah, I think definitely there is a place for sledging and trash talking in sport, and I think it can lead to choking. In that context.
Yeah, and over here we call it like getting into your kitchen, or someone's in your kitchen rent free, living there.
Yep, absolutely.
So, which one of those strategies would you recommend to counteract trash talking? Or is there one? That could be a question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess there's not. Well, it depends on what kind of kitchen you want to get into, or what kitchen they are getting into in that context. Certainly, when it's actually happening and trash talking and all that stuff, if someone does actually get into your head again, it's about concentration in that instance. And again, if it's a self-paced task where you can actually take some time to do a routine or something like that, get yourself out of that mindset, then obviously that might be a way to go about sort of stopping the thinking about those ideas. Again, in sports psych, we talk about thought stopping, and not thinking about what you just heard. That would be a technique, in that context to be able to just, not necessarily research based, but it's applied techniques where we, just stop thinking about what you just heard and switch back on to your concentration where you would normally to improve your performance. There's not really a specific intervention, a choking related intervention to suggest, but something that gets your concentration back on focus.
Right. So I want to end on this question, and this is something I'd like to ask all my guests about their areas of expertise. So what are some myths or misconceptions about choking that are common amongst athletes and coaches or even sports fans that are just, either not true or not as simple as we might think?
Yeah. So from a choking perspective.
Yeah.
So myths about choking. I guess one is just because someone doesn't win and they're expected to win doesn't necessarily mean it's choking. So Emily Seebohm, an Australian swimmer, I think it was in the 2012 Olympics. Correct me if I'm wrong in the year there, or forgive me if I'm wrong in the year there. She was expected to win in the 100 meter freestyle race, and she won silver by tenths of a second. And everyone was saying that she experienced choking, but in actuality, she might have been a little bit more nervous, and that might have cost her the gold medal. But you can't really say, being off by just a split second or milliseconds is a reason that or is a choking experience. So I guess that's one myth that you can kind of say you got to be a little bit less on your game than that in that from that point of view.
Yeah. And that's similar to here. Like when it comes to hockey in the Olympics or hockey in the World Junior Championships, if Team Canada doesn't win gold every time, then it's a choke job. Well, yeah. I mean, other teams could have just elevated their performance. They had a deeper team that year. And also, it gets dangerous when you label every time someone loses when they're expected to win a choker, because then that also creates that kind of like identity about them, and that's a bit of a dangerous game.
Yeah, and that's probably the worst part about it when people experience choking and people start calling them a choker. They might feel like that's a part of them, and that just creates more episodes that might happen, and goes back to the idea that you said of what do you do to get people to get out of that mindset. And exactly right, and that's something that creates more anxiety. And even in some of the studies that use qualitative interviews with some athletes, they chronic chokers always talked about that and said, look, I can't get out of my own head now. I can't think of anything else besides the fact that I have choked. And that's not necessarily great. It's, the mind's a wonderful thing, isn't it? The brain is a wonderful thing. It can create, mythical things that are not necessarily there, and perceived ideas that aren't necessarily there. And unfortunately, it can create bad things like, that experience of choking, and it's never going to go away, which is probably a bad thing. But hopefully your listeners will understand that, choking is not a death sentence, if you will. Everyone can overcome it as long as you concentrate better.
Right. And hopefully listeners also, next time they're watching a game and someone chokes, don't tweet at them and tell them they're chokers, because you never know what kind of damage you're doing to those people.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right.
So again, I took up a lot of your time, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time. Where can people find you and follow you in social media? Anything else?
Yeah. So I'm on Twitter. C Mesagno, I think, is my @handle. So feel free to follow me on Twitter. I'm at Federation University Australia. So if you just look up Chris Mesagno, I know Mesagno is spelled a little bit strangely, but if you look me up there, you can find my email address on the website and sort of go from there. So Twitter is probably the best place to find me in relation to that point of view. And if you want to chat with me, go ahead and follow me there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.